Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through history, where kings and queens walk the halls of time, and the echoes of the past lull us into a world of stories. Tonight, we will drift together through the life of a remarkable king, his queens, and the choices that shaped a kingdom. If you enjoy these gentle journeys into history, consider subscribing so you can join us for many more nights of calm, captivating tales. The year was 1509, and the bells of Westminster rang for a new beginning. Henry Tudor, not yet 20, stood before the altar crowned with gold and destiny. England, weary of his father's cautious reign, looked upon him as a dawn, bright, confident, radiant. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the glow of youth and the certainty that he had been chosen by God himself. His court whispered of his charm, his laughter, his skill in the tilt-yard. He seemed a prince of legend, born to heal a kingdom. Yet even on that summer morning, when sunlight filled the chapel like wine, a quiet unease stirred beneath the triumph. The crown, heavy with jewels, pressed not only on his brow but on his conscience. His father, Henry VII, had left him wealth, alliances, and a shadow, the expectation to preserve what had been so painfully won after decades of civil war. Catherine of Aragon, his bride, knelt beside him, serene, pious, and already carrying the ghosts of her first marriage. She was older, wise, a daughter of Spain's most powerful monarchs. To the crowd, their union was divine, sealing peace between England and the might of Europe. To Henry, it was a promise of legitimacy, proof that his bloodline would not fade like a candle in the wind. That night, as the celebrations echoed through Whitehall, Henry wandered from the feast. He paused before a mirror framed in gilded oak. In its reflection, he saw the young king, golden, certain, adored. But he also saw the faint outline of something else, a restlessness, an ache for glory beyond the prayers of his advisers or the expectations of his father. He did not yet know it, but that hunger, for greatness, for love, for immortality, would shape not only his reign, but the fate of England itself. Spring came to London in a burst of color, banners unfurled from the palace towers, lutes played in the courtyards, and the air itself seemed lighter under the rule of the young king. Henry's court was not like his father's, where Henry VII had counted every coin and measured every gesture. Henry VIII spent freely and lived loudly. He built his kingdom not on fear, but on spectacle, grand tournaments, lavish feasts, and music that carried through the night until the candles died. He was more than a monarch, he was the very embodiment of youth and beauty, and he wanted his court to mirror him, radiant, bold, divine. The scholars said he wrote poetry, the courtiers said he could outsing his own musicians. To those who watched him ride into the tilt-yard, sunlight gleaming off his armor, Henry was England's beating heart. But power, even when worn gracefully, hums with danger. Beneath the dances and the pageantry, old families still remembered the Wars of the Roses, the years when Englishmen killed their kin for crowns. Some watched Henry's vigor and saw not a savior but a boy too eager to please his reflection. Among them were his father's loyal counselors, cautious, deliberate, whispering that peace was fragile and glory, expensive. Catherine of Aragon watched too. She had come to love her husband in her quiet, solemn way, seeing in him the spirit of her own father, Ferdinand. But she was also a queen raised on duty, not desire. When she prayed for a son, an heir who would secure her husband's throne and silence the murmurs that England's fortune still rested on chance. The court waited as she bore child after child, most dying in infancy. The bells of London tolled for royal births and deaths almost in the same breath. Each loss drew a shadow longer than the last. Henry, once comforted by faith, began to look elsewhere for reasons. Was it God's will? Or a test of his strength as king? In those restless hours, when the corridors fell silent and the hearth burned low, he would turn again to music. He played not for pleasure but for clarity, notes rising like prayers that never reached heaven. His fingers lingered on the lute's strings as if searching for an answer hidden between the tones. It was in this quiet uncertainty that new faces began to appear at court, ambitious young men eager to please, and clever women who smiled too knowingly. Among them was one who would alter everything, but for now, she was only a name whispered, not yet fate. And so, while England slept beneath its new prosperity, the first fissure in its golden dream began to form, not in the realm, but in the heart of its king. The years moved like tides, steady, gilded, and increasingly heavy with silence. The court of Henry VIII had grown into one of the most dazzling in Europe, a theater of silk and politics where every gesture could shift a man's fortune. But within that shining court, the Queen's chambers became a quiet sanctuary of hope and sorrow. Catherine of Aragon prayed more often than she spoke. She prayed for her husband's soul, for England's peace, and most of all, for a child who would live. Her hands, once smooth and regal, grew calloused from rosary beads. She had given Henry one daughter, the solemn, sharp-eyed Mary, but to the king and his council, a daughter was no son. A princess could not secure a dynasty, not in a Europe ruled by men. At first, Henry's affection for Catherine was steadfast. He would sit beside her, tracing her hairline, calling her, "my dearest heart." But time is unkind to kings who have no heirs. Whispers spread like ivy through stone, that God had closed Catherine's womb as punishment, that England's future was at risk. And in Henry's dreams, a haunting began, not of spirits, but of legacy. He saw his father's shadow pacing through corridors, reminding him of all that had been fought for and how easily it could crumble. He saw himself as the last Tudor, his bloodline fading into the dark. When he awoke, he was drenched in sweat, and the crown at his bedside seemed heavier than any armor. To drown those thoughts, Henry turned to grandeur. He commissioned pageants and hunts, ordered tapestries from Flanders, and rebuilt his palaces into reflections of his own splendor. But the noise of celebration could not silence the ticking emptiness beneath it. It was during one of these feasts, an evening of dancing and laughter at Greenwich, that his eyes first lingered upon a young woman moving through the crowd. She was not the most beautiful in the court, nor the most obedient. But she carried herself with a peculiar confidence, poised, observing, aware of her power. Her name was Anne Boleyn, recently returned from France, where she had served in the court of Queen Claude. Henry did not yet know why he watched her so intently. Perhaps it was the way she did not look directly at him, or perhaps because she seemed to belong to another world, modern, foreign, and utterly beyond his reach. Later that night, Catherine sat alone by the fire, unaware that the first ember of her downfall had just been lit. She whispered her prayers as she always did, believing her devotion could still protect what love remained. But outside her chamber, history had already begun to shift, soft as a breath, unstoppable as dawn. The court had seen many ladies come and go, bright, silken faces passing through the golden light of Henry's attention, but Anne Boleyn was different. She moved through Whitehall not like a courtier, but like a question no one could answer. There was something distinctly un-English about her, the grace of France, the wit of a scholar, the restraint of someone who had studied power from a distance and understood its rhythm, and had returned from the French court with an elegance that made English ladies whisper and frown. She spoke of poetry, of manners, of queens who ruled not with swords but with words. When she danced, she did not smile too freely; when she curtsied, it was never with surrender. Men found themselves leaning forward when she spoke, not because of her beauty, but because she seemed to know something they did not. Henry noticed her first in the tilt of her head, the way her eyes held him a moment too long and then turned away. He asked her name once, twice, and when he learned she was sister to Mary Boleyn, a woman who had already shared his bed, he laughed. Yet Anne was no repetition of her sister. When the king sent her a gift, a brooch shaped like a falcon, she returned it with a note so delicately phrased that it read like both a refusal and an invitation. That small act, a woman denying a king, was unheard of. It intrigued him more than any conquest on the battlefield. The pursuit became a melody that played in his mind at all hours, her laughter echoing down corridors, her French perfume lingering long after she had gone. But Catherine saw it too. She watched her husband's glances grow longer, his silences deeper. The queen had been raised among rulers, she knew the language of shifting loyalty. Still, she did not speak of it, not to Henry, not even to her confessor. Instead, she prayed harder. She believed her faith could still protect her marriage. At night, Henry wrote to Anne, long, feverish letters, filled with declarations of love and guilt. He swore that she alone had awakened his soul. He spoke of God's plan, of destiny, of a new beginning. And Anne, cautious but calculating, answered in kind, words full of humility that glimmered faintly with ambition. For Henry, this was no longer mere desire. It was a revelation. He began to wonder if perhaps his lack of a male heir was not Catherine's fault but a divine sign that he was meant to start anew. In that thought lay the seed of England's greatest rupture. In the quiet corners of his mind, the song of power began to change its tune. No longer the melody of kingship, now it was the call of obsession. Winter wrapped London in its grey silence, but within the walls of Whitehall, the air was fevered. The king, restless, brilliant, increasingly consumed, had fallen not merely in love, but into conviction. He believed now that Anne Boleyn had been sent by Providence itself. That her presence, her wit, her refusal, all of it was divine correction. If Catherine had been duty, and was revelation. He began to see Scripture differently. At first in quiet readings by candlelight, then aloud to his chaplains. The words of Leviticus burned in his mind, "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing." Catherine had been married to his brother, Arthur. Could it be that their union was cursed from the start? That God had withheld sons not as punishment, but as warning? He carried this question like a flame through the corridors of court. To Thomas Wolsey, his loyal cardinal and Lord Chancellor, he confided his torment, "I am trapped, Wolsey. Bound to a marriage God himself has forbidden." Wolsey, ever the statesman, heard the hunger beneath the piety and knew the danger in it. "Your Grace," he said gently, "these matters of heaven are best weighed with patience. Rome will not yield easily." But patience had never been Henry's gift. Anne, meanwhile, played her part with delicate precision. She was neither cold nor yielding, a dance of presence and absence. When the king drew near, she retreated; when he withdrew, she shone just enough to pull him back. Courtiers watched in awe, and in terror. For the king's affection was not a thing one shared safely. In letters, Henry addressed her as, "my only one, my heart, my mistress and my servant." He wrote that his body ached for her, but that what he desired most was her soul, her faith, her promise, her destiny with him. And responded with modesty wrapped in brilliance. She spoke of virtue, of patience, of wishing only to be worthy of his love. Yet every word bound him closer. Catherine's allies began to whisper of witchcraft, of seduction beyond mortal means. But Anne did not need sorcery. She had wit, and the knowledge of how deeply a king could fear his own mortality. When Henry next looked at his queen, he saw not a woman, but the embodiment of failure, a past that chained him. When he looked at Anne, he saw possibility, rebirth, the golden sun promised in every prophecy. And so he resolved, he would seek annulment. He would challenge Rome itself if he must. For the king had convinced himself that God was not against him, but with him. That night, as snow fell quietly over the Thames, Henry stood by the window and whispered into the frost. "If I must break the world to build my destiny, then so be it." The question of Henry's marriage, what history would later call the king's great matter, began as a whisper and grew into a storm that shook the foundations of Christendom. What had started as one man's restless conscience now spread through the corridors of power, carried by letters, rumors, and fear. Henry, convinced that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, demanded the church annul it. He sent envoys to Rome, filled his council with theologians willing to defend his cause, and wrote to the Pope himself, arguing that his conscience would not rest until he was free to marry the woman he believed chosen by God. But Rome hesitated. The Pope, Clement VII, was no longer a free man; he was a prisoner, politically and spiritually, of Emperor Charles V, Catherine's own nephew. To grant Henry's request would be to insult the might of Spain and risk war. Meanwhile, Anne's influence grew. She was no longer merely a courtly fascination; she had become a presence that reshaped everything around her. Her enemies multiplied, yet her composure never broke. "I will wait," she told her family. "If he loves me as he says, he will find a way." Catherine, hearing of the proceedings, remained steadfast. "I am the king's true wife," she declared before the council. "God is my judge, and I have been a faithful wife for 20 years. Her dignity pierced even those who opposed her. Henry avoided her eyes whenever they met; her faith was a mirror in which his own doubts reflected back at him. Thomas Wolsey, once the king's most trusted servant, struggled to balance loyalty with survival. He knew the Pope would never yield, but to tell Henry that was to risk ruin. He promised, delayed, negotiated, and prayed. But time was running out. By 1529, the king's patience had thinned to fury. "If Rome will not free me," he said, "then England shall." The words hung heavy, the first crack in the wall between crown and church. And in that moment, history trembled. Thomas Wolsey had built his life on the favor of kings. He was a butcher's son who rose to become the second most powerful man in England, richer than dukes, grander than bishops, feared even in Rome. But now, every triumph of his past became a weight around his neck. The king, frustrated and humiliated by Rome's refusal, turned his anger on the men who had promised him deliverance. Wolsey, once called Alter Rex, the other king, was now accused of betrayal. Anne's family, the ambitious Boleyns, saw their chance to destroy him. Letters were brought forth, some true, some forged, claiming Wolsey had served the Pope before his sovereign. His enemies whispered that he had delayed the annulment deliberately, hoping to please both sides and keep his own power intact. Henry, stung by failure and by pride, needed someone to blame. Wolsey was stripped of office. His seals of power taken, his palaces confiscated. He retreated to York, a fallen titan among priests and monks. Yet even there, he dreamed of reconciliation. "If I could but see the king once more," he said to his servants, "I could mend it all." He never would. On his journey south, summoned under the guise of pardon, Wolsey fell ill. Some said grief killed him, others poison. His last words were whispered to the priest at his side. "If I had served my God as I served my king, he would not have left me naked to my enemies." When news reached Henry, he stared into the fire for a long time and said nothing. Anne, hearing it, only nodded once. The age of Wolsey was over. The age of the Boleyns had begun. By 1531, Henry's resolve had hardened into something beyond passion. It was now doctrine. He had convinced himself that his cause was righteous, and that all opposition to it was treason not against a man, but against God's chosen ruler. The Pope's defiance had transformed love into revolution. Advisers came and went, many falling silent when the king's will turned fierce. But one rose in Wolsey's shadow, Thomas Cromwell, a man of keen mind and unshakable purpose. Where Wolsey had served both God and king, Cromwell served only England, or rather, the England that Henry envisioned, sovereign, unbound, and absolute. Cromwell spoke carefully but firmly. "Your Majesty," he said, "the Pope's power over England exists only because we permit it. You are the anointed head of this realm, its laws, its conscience, its faith. If Rome denies you justice, then justice must be made here." And so, piece by piece, Henry began to reshape the kingdom's soul. Parliament was summoned. Clergymen were pressed to acknowledge the king, not the Pope, as the supreme head of the Church in England. Some protested. Others bent. Fear is a stronger scripture than faith. By 1533, the transformation was complete. The bond with Rome was severed, the Church of England born in defiance of centuries. Henry's marriage to Catherine was declared null. Anne, at last, was to be queen. The coronation was a spectacle of gold and crimson, filled with music and flowers and uneasy eyes. The people cheered, but beneath the shouts, unease lingered, the scent of something sacred broken. And was radiant, her dark hair crowned with jewels, her expression poised between triumph and disbelief. She had fought the world and won. Yet in the quiet of that evening, when the festivities had faded, she looked at herself in the mirror and saw not victory, but expectation. for she was carrying the child who must justify it all. Summer of 1533 was unseasonably bright. The gardens of Greenwich bloomed with an almost defiant abundance, as if nature itself wished to celebrate England's new beginning. Henry visited and daily, his pride swelling with each month of her swelling belly. "It will be a prince," he said to anyone who would listen. "A son to secure the Tudor line and silence the doubters forever." And smiled when he said it, but deep down she feared what he would not allow himself to imagine. She prayed in secret, not for a son, but for a living child, one who would survive the dangers that had haunted Catherine's pregnancies. On the 7th of September, after hours of pain and silence, a child's cry pierced the chambers. A healthy baby, strong and bright-eyed. But when the midwife lifted the infant toward the king, Henry's smile faltered for just a heartbeat. The child was a girl, and named her Elizabeth, after Henry's mother, a name chosen to suit the king's pride. Courtiers murmured that the baby was fair and vigorous, and the king, to his credit, did not hide his affection. "She will be the jewel of her house," he declared. Yet in his voice, pride and disappointment tangled like vines. Anne's triumph was shadowed from its first breath. The court that had worshipped her began to turn its gaze elsewhere, some whispering that God had again denied Henry a son, others muttering that the Queen's favor would fade as quickly as it had risen. Still, Anne believed. She held her daughter close and whispered promises that Elizabeth would be educated, free, brilliant beyond measure. "You will not need a man's crown to rule," she told the infant, her voice trembling with something like prophecy. Outside, the bells rang across the river, not for victory, but for change. England had a new princess, a new faith, and a king who had burned his bridges for love. And though none could know it then, the child born that day would one day surpass them all. The years that followed Elizabeth's birth were gilded with ceremony but shadowed by unease. Henry's fascination with Anne, once unshakable, began to shift like a reflection on water. Courtiers whispered that the king's eyes had grown restless, and even sensed the subtle cooling of his ardor. Her beauty had not faded, nor her wit, but the appetite for novelty, for challenge, for conquest, burned strong in a king who had never known true restraint. And tried to meet him with grace, offering counsel and charm in equal measure, yet she could not anticipate the depth of Henry's ambition. He spoke of dynasties, of heirs, of history itself, and she felt herself drawn into a story larger than love or loyalty, one written in blood and law, where women were often pawns and sometimes queens. Meanwhile, the king's advisers, sensing the shift, began to maneuver. Cromwell, ever watchful, saw both danger and opportunity. He reminded Henry of his conscience, of the prayers that had justified the annulment of Catherine's marriage. "Your Majesty," he said one morning, "we are shaping the realm, but the realm watches you as much as you guide it. Beware letting affection cloud judgment." In private, Henry wrestled with his conscience. He remembered Catherine, her quiet dignity, and the years of devotion she had given. Though she no longer stood before him as queen, her presence lingered in memory, in counsel, and in the faces of the people who had grown to respect her. Guilt twisted beneath his pride, a subtle but persistent ache that even his lust for power could not banish. Anne, keenly perceptive, sensed the unspoken. She began to push herself forward, to assert influence, to charm not only Henry but those around him. Yet in doing so, she drew attention, the attention of rivals, of schemers, and of the king himself. Every courtly smile, every whispered jest, became a thread in the growing tapestry of intrigue. The tension between desire and duty, affection and ambition, set the stage for events that would shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Henry, more a king of law than of hearts, found himself torn between the woman he loved, the child he desired, and the crown that demanded obedience. By 1535, Henry's court had become a chessboard. Each smile, each gesture, each word could be read as loyalty or betrayal. And walked carefully, her mind sharpened by necessity. She knew the king's devotion could turn to wrath, and that his advisers were waiting for a misstep to justify their claims. Elizabeth, now nearly 2, played quietly in the nursery, unaware of the currents that surrounded her. She was a child of promise and political consequence, her existence both triumph and reminder of what was missing: a son to secure the dynasty, a male heir to satisfy the king's restless mind. Henry, too, was changing. The exhilaration of victory, of divorcing Catherine and marrying Anne, began to fade, replaced by the constant weight of expectation. Advisers murmured of disfavor, of plots, of the king's moods. He questioned whether Anne could bear him a son, whether she was truly capable of giving him what he most desired. At night, Henry wandered the halls alone. The echoes of his own footsteps reminded him of the fragility of power. He was surrounded by gold and splendor, yet the absence of a male heir gnawed at him, whispering that his legacy might crumble. Anne felt the shift, though she did not yet name it aloud. She understood that love at court was always entwined with fear, that even the king's favor was a precarious throne. The soft sighs of the corridors, the rustle of silk, the muted conversations behind closed doors, all told her that the tide was turning. In that quiet, Henry and Anne both realized the unspoken truth: desire, power, and history rarely align. And in the heart of the king, a new reckoning had begun, one that would decide the fate of wives, daughters, and the crown itself. The spring of 1536 arrived with a brittle hope. Courtiers lined the corridors of Greenwich, holding their breath as Anne's labor began. Henry, usually so commanding, paced nervously in the adjoining chambers, his mind alive with visions of a son, the long-awaited male heir who would cement his legacy and vindicate his tumultuous path. Every ticking clock, every murmur of attendants, weighed on him like judgment itself. Hours passed. The air was heavy with incense, the cries of midwives mixing with the muted sobs of anticipation. Finally, a child emerged, a son, strong and screaming, wrapped in swaddling cloth. For a moment, the court exhaled, a collective sigh of triumph echoing through the gilded halls. Henry embraced the infant, his eyes bright with tears and pride, murmuring promises of protection, legacy, and glory. But fate, ever capricious, had its own hand. The boy, fragile and pale, did not survive the night. In the quiet that followed, the cries of celebration turned to whispers of mourning. And wept, a woman torn between grief and resolve, while Henry, though furious and broken, held his composure for the court. He knew history would judge him by his legacy, and that legacy now felt dangerously incomplete. The loss cast a shadow over Greenwich. The courtiers whispered that divine wrath had punished ambition, that the king's desires had overstepped mortal bounds. Anne's influence wavered, and Henry's gaze grew colder, more calculating. Even the Queen of England herself, who had once been the darling of the court, now felt the fragility of her position. Grief has a way of sharpening ambition. In the weeks following the child's death, factions emerged like cracks in a stone wall. Some whispered that Anne had bewitched the king, that her charm had driven him from reason. Others argued for restraint, urging Henry to reconcile with Catherine, whose steadfast virtue remained a model to the people. Cromwell moved carefully, navigating this volatile sea. He advised the king with measured words, reminding him that power depended not only on desire but on timing, alliances, and perception. He counseled patience with Anne, even as Henry's temper and longing pressed for action. And herself became wary. She understood that the king's heart, once steadfast, could now be swayed by rumor, fear, or disappointment. She cultivated loyalty among the ladies of the court, spoke wisely in council gatherings, and ensured her charm was measured, not reckless. Yet even her careful steps could not prevent murmurs, whispers that grew louder with every passing day. Catherine, though removed from courtly favor, remained a symbol of endurance and duty. Her prayers continued, private and fervent, and many remembered her not as the defeated, but as the faithful wife who had endured years of political turbulence with grace. Henry, caught between desire, disappointment, and duty, grew restless. The court, like a living organism, sensed the tension and thrived on it. Every smile, every glance, every word could tip the balance. In this delicate equilibrium, the king's decisions would not only shape his marriage and the succession, but the very soul of England itself. By the autumn of 1536, the winds of fortune had turned sharply against Anne Boleyn. The court, once enchanted by her wit and presence, now whispered with cautious fear. Henry's initial fascination had begun to harden into suspicion, and the king, a man used to bending wills and shaping destinies, became intolerant of any challenge to his desire for legacy. Anne, still beautiful and clever, was no longer untouchable. Her sharp words, once admired, were now interpreted as defiance. Her dances at court, once captivating, were seen as deliberate provocations. Rumors, some rooted in jealousy, others in ambition, began to swirl, that Anne had enchanted the king with magic, that her pride and intellect were dangerous, that she had failed to deliver a male heir. The Boleyn faction wavered. Allies who had once supported her now looked to protect themselves, distancing from her as the king's favor cooled. Cromwell, ever pragmatic, observed quietly, collecting evidence, gauging Henry's moods, and preparing for the inevitable. Henry, meanwhile, wrestled with his conscience. He remembered the vows he had taken, the promises of love, and the thrill of Anne's presence. But desire was no longer enough to anchor him. The absence of a son, coupled with the court's murmurs, ignited a cold resolve. Power demanded action. And sensed the change. One evening, in her private chambers, she looked into the mirror, seeing not only herself but the shadows of the court pressing in. Fear gripped her, but she held her posture, aware that her survival depended on composure, on charm, on the very presence that had once enthralled a king. As Anne's favor waned, another woman's influence began to rise, Jane Seymour, gentle, obedient, and poised with a quiet intelligence that contrasted sharply with Anne's fiery presence. Jane was aware of the delicate balance at court and moved like water, flowing where paths opened. Henry noticed her immediately. She did not provoke with words or gestures, but her calm and graceful demeanor spoke to the king's longing for stability and heirs. While Anne had stirred his passion, Jane promised continuity and a future that Anne, with all her brilliance, seemed unable to secure. The court watched closely. Courtiers who had once bowed to and began to court Jane's favor subtly, ensuring their loyalties aligned with Henry's shifting affections. Anne, though perceptive, could sense the tide of change but could not yet act to counter it. The machinery of court politics was already turning against her. Catherine of Aragon, long gone from the center of power but never forgotten, remained a symbol of steadfast devotion. Even in exile, her virtue cast a quiet light that contrasted with the shifting shadows of Anne and Jane. Henry's mind, always restless, began to fix on the future. He imagined a son, a dynasty, a kingdom secured. The memory of lost heirs and the fragile Elizabeth lingered, pressing him toward decisions that would reshape not only his personal life but the history of England itself. The stage was set, a fallen queen, a rising rival, and a king whose desires now dictated the fate of all who surrounded him. Spring of 1536 brought more than blossoms to England, it brought judgment. Anne Boleyn, once queen and the dazzling center of the court, was summoned to face accusations that would determine her life, her legacy, and the future of the crown. The charges were grave: adultery, treason, and witchcraft, whispers amplified by jealousy, fear, and the king's restless ambition. Henry, though once enamored, now watched from his chambers, a mixture of sorrow and resolve shadowing his features. He was convinced that history demanded action. If he desired a dynasty, if he sought stability for England, then no personal attachment could stand in the way. Every whisper at court, every glance from his advisers, reinforced the certainty that Anne must be removed. The trial itself was a spectacle. Courtiers, foreign dignitaries, and clergy gathered to witness the proceedings. Witnesses, coerced or persuaded, recounted supposed betrayals, each testimony more chilling than the last. Anne, aware of the stakes, maintained her composure. She denied the charges with dignity and wit, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Yet in every corner, men and women read her courage as defiance, a final, fateful mistake. Cromwell, the architect behind the proceedings, watched carefully. Every word, every gesture, was a calculated move to secure Henry's objectives while maintaining the illusion of justice. The wheels of power were turning, and Anne, brilliant as she was, found herself caught in their grip. Henry's heart, though still touched by affection, hardened as the verdict approached. History, duty, and desire had merged into a single, unforgiving path. May 19, 1536, would be remembered forever in England's memory. Anne Boleyn, once queen, once muse, stood upon the scaffold. Her hair, now uncovered, caught the sunlight as she faced the executioner with calm resolve. The court, silent with tension, watched as the final act of a turbulent chapter unfolded. And spoke softly, her words measured and composed. She asked forgiveness from those she might have wronged, she prayed for the king, and she embraced the fate that history had written for her. In her last moments, she remained both proud and human, a figure of tragedy and dignity intertwined. Henry, observing from the palace, felt a cold mix of loss and relief. The court was now clear for Jane Seymour, whose quiet presence promised continuity, stability, and, most importantly, the son he so long desired. Anne's brilliance and defiance would not be forgotten, but her fall had made way for the ambitions of others. Cromwell and Henry moved swiftly. Anne's possessions were catalogued, her allies watched closely, and the machinery of succession began to turn toward a new queen. The court exhaled, a kingdom both mournful and relieved, as life continued under the relentless demands of crown and legacy. The summer of 1536 brought a new light to Whitehall. Jane Seymour, poised and serene, entered the court not with the fire of Anne Boleyn, but with a calm that seemed to steady the very air around her. Her demeanor was quiet, her words measured, and her movements deliberate, all of it signaling a woman who understood the precarious balance of power and affection at Henry's court. Henry, still haunted by the loss of Anne and the memory of past missteps, found comfort in Jane's composure. She did not challenge him with wit or ambition, but she offered something equally potent: reassurance. Her presence whispered of continuity, of family, of a lineage that could finally bring England the security it had long sought. Courtiers observed the subtle shifts. Where once factions had formed around Anne's brilliance and defiance, now they cautiously aligned with Jane's gentle influence. She was admired not for the spectacle she created, but for the promise she represented, a future yet unwritten, a son who could one day inherit the crown. Jane herself navigated these treacherous waters with care. She maintained respect for Anne's memory while cultivating her own connection to the king. Every smile, every gesture, every silent glance was intentional, a negotiation of presence and influence, learned from the very palace that had witnessed Anne's rise and fall. The kingdom, watching and waiting, began to sense a shift. England had endured turbulence, scandal, and tragedy. Now, it hoped for stability, embodied in the grace of a woman who neither demanded attention nor provoked fear. By autumn, Henry's mind was filled with anticipation once again. Jane's influence, gentle and unwavering, had restored a sense of calm to the court, but more importantly, it brought with it the promise Henry had long yearned for: an heir. The king, whose thoughts had been haunted by the absence of sons and the fragility of legacy, now imagined a future secure and lasting. Jane, too, felt the weight of expectation. She knew that her role extended beyond companionship. She was now the vessel through which England's future would be carried. Every decision, every moment of composure, reinforced the delicate thread upon which both her life and the kingdom's continuity depended. The king's eyes, once restless and searching, softened in her presence. He no longer sought the thrill of defiance or the spark of untamed wit. He sought stability, lineage, and the quiet assurance that his dynasty could endure. In Jane, he saw not just a wife, but a partner in the long, unending task of securing England's place in history. As the weeks passed, hope blossomed quietly within the palace walls. The king and his new queen navigated the delicate rhythms of court, aware of the shadows of the past but focused on the fragile promise of what lay ahead. And somewhere in the distance, the memory of Anne lingered, a reminder of passion, loss, and the extraordinary consequences of desire intertwined with power. Winter had settled over England in 1537, painting the city and countryside in soft frost. Within the walls of Whitehall, anticipation hung thick like incense in the chapel. Jane Seymour, serene and resolute, carried the hopes of a nation in her womb. The king's gaze followed her constantly, a mixture of reverence, longing, and impatience. Every day seemed a test of fate, every hour a reminder of the precarious balance between desire and destiny. Courtiers whispered behind velvet screens, some out of hope, others from fear. The court had witnessed the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn, and none wished to repeat history. Cromwell advised caution, reminding the king that public perception, rumor, and timing were as crucial as Henry's determination. Henry listened, but his mind was occupied with dreams of a son, a living, breathing future for the Tudor dynasty. Jane, aware of her significance, moved with the grace of one bearing a kingdom's weight. Her quiet strength inspired loyalty among the ladies of the court, and even the king's advisers treated her with newfound respect. In her presence, the king found calm, a rare respite from the restless energy that had haunted him for years. The palace itself seemed to anticipate the coming child. Cradle makers prepared fine instruments of comfort, kitchens filled with nourishing foods, and the chaplains prayed incessantly, invoking God's blessing upon the queen and her unborn child. Yet, as always, fate is unpredictable. In the quiet of her chambers, Jane felt both joy and fear, the awareness that this child would carry not only the hopes of a father but the weight of a nation. The king's eyes, always watchful, met hers one evening and lingered, silent with unspoken hope. On October 12, 1537, the quiet of the palace halls was broken by the cries of a newborn. Jane Seymour had given birth to a son, healthy and robust, who would come to be known as Edward VI. The king, who had longed for this moment for decades, wept openly, clutching the infant in his arms. In those tears was relief, triumph, and the fulfillment of a dream that had defined much of his reign. The court erupted in celebration. Bells tolled across London, trumpets sounded, and the streets overflowed with jubilant citizens. The newborn prince symbolized not only the continuation of the Tudor line but also the fragile promise of stability in a kingdom often tested by upheaval and intrigue. Jane, pale but radiant, held Edward close, her calm composure hiding the exhaustion of childbirth. She had fulfilled her role with grace, and the king's affection was unwavering. For a moment, the court seemed to pause, collectively exhaling as the future, long desired, had finally arrived. Yet the shadow of history lingered. The memory of Anne Boleyn's rise and fall, the trials, the intrigues, and the sorrow, reminded all that power and fortune are delicate, easily swayed by fate's unseen hand. Edward's birth was cause for joy, but also a reminder, the crown's weight never lessens, and the crown's demands never cease. With Edward secure in his father's arms, Jane Seymour's influence over Henry reached a quiet peak. Unlike Anne Boleyn's fiery sway, Jane's power was subtle, almost imperceptible. She moved through court with calm authority, her composure a mirror of the stability Henry had long sought. Her triumph was not in spectacle, but in the profound relief she had brought to the king, and to England itself. The courtiers recognized it immediately. Her presence seemed to steady the restless energies of the palace. Advisers deferred to her counsel, ladies of the court mirrored her demeanor, and even Henry's temper seemed softened in her quiet company. Jane had become not merely a queen, but the linchpin of a kingdom's fragile peace. Yet Jane herself understood the impermanence of favor. She had watched the rise and fall of Anne Boleyn. She knew that love and influence, however genuine, were never guaranteed. Every gesture, every smile, was calculated not for vanity but for survival. In private, she prayed for strength, wisdom, and humility, understanding that her legacy depended as much on her spirit as her beauty. Edward, meanwhile, became the center of attention, a living promise of continuity. The king's eyes sparkled when he looked at his son, and in that gaze lay the deepest affection, tempered by the knowledge of duty. Jane observed quietly, aware that her role as mother and queen now intertwined with the fate of a dynasty. As winter softened into spring, Henry often found himself wandering the empty corridors of Whitehall alone. He looked at portraits of past kings, at tapestries depicting battles and triumphs, and at relics of a history that had been his inheritance and burden. The birth of Edward had fulfilled one long-sought goal, yet the weight of his reign pressed upon him more heavily than ever. He reflected on his previous marriages, Catherine of Aragon's unwavering devotion, and Boleyn's brilliance and tragedy, and on the choices he had made. Each queen had shaped him, each union had left marks upon his soul. Henry's mind was a landscape of memory, regret, triumph, and expectation. He realized that the crown demanded more than love, it demanded sacrifice, vigilance, and sometimes ruthless clarity. The king also contemplated his legacy. Edward's birth was a promise, but promises must be nurtured. The boy would inherit more than wealth or titles, he would inherit the tumult of a kingdom shaped by his father's desires, triumphs, and failures. Henry understood that the future depended not only on strength but on wisdom, and that every decision, even those taken in moments of passion, echoed through generations. And so, amidst tapestries of history, in the silent glow of candlelight, Henry stood alone, a king fulfilled yet restless, aware that even triumph carries the quiet weight of responsibility. The joy of Edward's birth was tempered by the fragility of life. Jane Seymour, though radiant in the weeks following the child's arrival, began to weaken. The palace whispered with concern, attendants spoke softly of her pallor, of her fatigue, of the shadows under her eyes that even the finest silks could not hide. Henry, despite his pride and the demands of the crown, watched her with anxiety. He saw in Jane's quiet suffering the cost of bringing the future into the world, a cost that weighed upon every mother and every queen. The courtiers, while offering support, also understood the precariousness of the moment. The health of the queen was inseparable from the stability of the dynasty. Jane's prayers, private and fervent, now carried the weight of England's hopes. She whispered to Edward, to the heavens, to God, seeking protection not for herself but for the boy who would one day wear the crown. The palace, usually filled with music and laughter, became subdued, the joy of triumph shadowed by the fear of loss. And then, in the quiet hours before dawn, Jane passed away. Her death, though not violent or scandalous, struck the court with profound grief. Henry, devastated, found himself once more confronting the intersection of love, power, and mortality. The king mourned not only the woman who had given him his son but the fleeting tranquility she had brought to a life often turbulent and fraught with ambition. With Jane's passing, the court became a place of hushed anticipation. The king, though still mourning, recognized the fragile reality of succession. The kingdom required care, protection, and guidance, even amidst personal sorrow. Edward, now an infant of few months, became the focal point of all attention. Every noble, every attendant, every advisor watched and waited, aware that the child embodied both hope and vulnerability. Henry's gaze, once softened by Jane's calm influence, grew sharper, more calculated. He observed the courtiers' every gesture, measuring loyalty, subtlety, and ambition. Cromwell, ever astute, continued to navigate the shifting tides of favor, ensuring that the realm remained under careful control even as grief pervaded the palace. Amidst this delicate balance, whispers began to circulate. Who would become Henry's next queen? Which woman could secure the dynasty, placate the king's desires, and maintain the fragile stability of the court? Every smile, every gesture, every carefully composed interaction became a subtle negotiation for favor, for influence, for survival. In this tense equilibrium, the palace seemed suspended, a court in waiting, a kingdom poised on the cusp of change. The shadow of loss had entered the king's life, yet it also shaped the future, guiding decisions, inspiring alliances, and shaping the destiny of England itself. The corridors of Whitehall buzzed quietly with expectation and gossip. A new figure had entered the king's attention, Katherine Howard, young, radiant, and seemingly innocent. Her beauty was striking, but it was the air of naivety combined with charm that captured Henry's gaze. She moved with the confidence of youth yet carried herself with a delicate grace that belied the dangerous games of court. Henry, still grieving Jane, found in Katherine a spark of exhilaration he had not felt in years. Her laughter, her soft voice, and her bright eyes awakened a fascination that quickly spread through the palace. Courtiers whispered eagerly, noting how the king lingered when she passed, how his moods brightened at her presence, and how alliances subtly shifted around her favor. Cromwell observed with caution. He had seen the rise and fall of queens before and understood that youth alone could not guarantee safety. Catherine's influence, while captivating to the king, carried both risk and opportunity. Her presence in the court began to realign loyalties, subtly but unmistakably, as courtiers sought to align themselves with the new source of power. Katherine, aware of her newfound importance, began to navigate the palace with careful steps. She learned the ways of the court, the expectations of the king, and the precarious line between favor and suspicion. Every smile was measured, every word intentional, and every glance a subtle negotiation of survival. Yet in the quiet chambers and shadowed hallways, those who remembered Anne Boleyn's fate knew that Henry's passion could be both fleeting and dangerous. The court waited, poised between hope, ambition, and the potential for tragedy. With Katherine Howard's ascent came the inevitable murmurs. The court, a living organism of ambition and observation, began to hum with speculation. Some whispered of her innocence, others of her cunning, some claimed she was destined to bring joy to the king, others feared she would meet the same fate as Anne Boleyn. Henry, consumed by desire, often appeared restless. He sought Catherine's presence constantly, and the intensity of his gaze unsettled those accustomed to reading the subtle rhythms of his moods. Every gesture, every conversation in the palace, became a performance under the watchful eyes of observers, nobles, courtiers, and ladies-in-waiting, all attuned to the king's favor. Cromwell worked behind the scenes, aware that intrigue could erupt into disaster if not carefully managed. He reminded the king of the delicate balance required to maintain both power and legitimacy, though Henry's attention was increasingly divided between politics and passion. Katherine, sensing the unspoken expectations and the dangerous weight of influence, tread carefully. She was young and inexperienced, but her awareness of the court's rhythms and the king's desires allowed her to navigate with surprising skill. Every smile, every whispered word, every subtle gesture was a negotiation, not merely for favor, but for survival in a world where history had shown that the fall from grace could be swift and irreversible. The court, alive with tension, anticipation, and the shadow of past tragedies, braced for the unfolding drama, knowing that the fate of queens, courtiers, and even the future of the crown itself hung delicately in the balance. Katherine Howard's position in court grew steadily, but with every step forward, the weight of history pressed upon her. She was aware, even in moments of laughter and apparent carefreeness, that the palace remembered the fates of Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour. Every move she made was scrutinized by allies and rivals alike. To please the king was to survive, to misstep was to court disaster. The young queen-in-waiting spent her days learning the rituals, the politics, and the delicate art of influence. She observed the ladies of the court, listening to their advice, noting their alliances, and quietly assessing who might be trusted. Her charm was natural, but it was matched with a growing awareness of the power it could wield, and the dangers it invited. Henry, captivated by her youthful exuberance, allowed her presence to fill the void left by Jane. Yet even as he was enthralled, he remained the king, vigilant, exacting, and prone to sudden shifts of mood. He watched Katherine closely, drawn to her innocence yet aware that any mistake could destabilize the careful order of his court. Cromwell, always observant, monitored the delicate balance. Katherine's ascent required guidance, subtle corrections, and careful counsel, for the palace was a place where admiration and envy walked hand in hand. Each day in waiting brought Katherine closer to the ultimate prize, the crown, but also closer to the scrutiny that had undone her predecessors. The court held its breath. England waited. The fragile equilibrium between ambition, love, and duty hung by a slender thread, ready to be tested by passion, politics, and history's unyielding demands. By 1540, Henry's mind and heart were restless once more. The loss of Jane Seymour had left an indelible mark, and the exhilaration of Anne Boleyn's rise and fall lingered like a shadow over his desires. Katherine Howard, now emerging as a beacon of youth and charm, captivated him in ways that reminded him of the very forces that had shaped his previous marriages. He wandered the palace corridors, recalling moments of passion, grief, and triumph, understanding that each queen had influenced not only his emotions but the course of England itself. Desire, power, and legacy intertwined in his mind, forming a complex tapestry that guided his decisions with relentless intensity. Katherine, feeling the weight of the king's gaze and the expectations it carried, moved cautiously. She knew that charm alone could not secure favor, that wisdom, discretion, and timing were equally necessary. Her every smile, her every gesture, was an attempt to navigate the treacherous currents of court life without sinking beneath them. The court, attuned to Henry's moods, adapted with quiet precision. Courtiers whispered, advisors counseled, and the palace thrummed with anticipation. The king's restless heart, a force both intimate and political, dictated the rhythm of life in the kingdom. And in that tension, history waited, ready to be written by passion, choice, and the delicate interplay of power. As the years passed, Henry VIII's court became a tapestry woven from triumph, loss, and ambition. The queens who had entered his life, Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and Katherine Howard, each left their mark, shaping the king, the court, and the destiny of England itself. Their stories, intertwined with the king's desires and decisions, had molded a nation and its faith, leaving echoes that would resonate for generations. Edward, Jane Seymour's son, grew under the careful watch of tutors and advisors, a living promise of continuity and stability. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, carried within her the spark of intellect and resilience, the hidden force that would one day illuminate the kingdom. The succession was no longer a simple question of desire, it was a legacy, crafted through sacrifice, strategy, and the interplay of human ambition. Henry himself, older now, reflected upon the years with a mixture of pride and contemplation. He had loved fiercely, ruled decisively, and shaped the spiritual and political landscape of England in ways no monarch had done before. His passions, his mistakes, and his relentless pursuit of legacy had left a kingdom transformed, stronger, independent, yet forever marked by the personal costs of power. The court, alive with memory and expectation, continued to turn. Courtiers moved carefully, aware of history's lessons and the enduring presence of the crown's demands. The palace held whispers of past queens, the laughter and tears of children, and the quiet authority of a king who had forged a new path for England. In the end, the legacy was not only the crown or the heirs it produced, but the story itself, a tale of love and loss, ambition and reflection, resilience and fate. And as night fell over the palace, the halls whispered softly of history and of dreams, of a kingdom shaped by its ruler and the remarkable women who had walked beside him, each leaving a mark that would endure beyond time. The story closed gently, leaving the listener in a quiet reverie, the kind that lingers like a soft candle glow before sleep, a tale of power, passion, and the slow unfolding of history, perfect for drifting into dreams. And so, our story for tonight comes to a close. The crown rests, the halls grow quiet, and the whispers of history fade into soft shadows. Remember, the echoes of the past remain, guiding, teaching, and inspiring. Rest now, dear listener, and let the slow rhythm of history carry you into dreams. Tomorrow, another tale awaits, as gentle and intriguing as this one.